Welcome to Geopolitics Decanted. I'm your host, Dmitri Alperovitch, and this is a podcast where we go deep behind the headlines to analyze the pressing geopolitical issues of the day. Today, we continue to dive into the Israel-Iran war, which may have just ended. We have an announcement from President Trump, literally as we're recording this episode, that a ceasefire has been reached. So we shall see what happens with that. But either way, it seems like a good time to talk about BDA, Battle Damage Assessment, specifically for the Iranian nuclear program. And I'm very pleased to bring back a guest who's been on this program a number of times now to discuss various nuclear weapons-related issues, Dr. Jeffrey Lewis, a professor at Middlebury Institute and an expert on nuclear nonproliferation issues. Welcome back to the show, Jeffrey.
Hey, it's great to be talking.
All right, so maybe we start at a very high level because this is a very complicated topic, very technical topic, but this is what this podcast is about. And maybe you can talk to us about what goes into a uranium-based nuclear weapon cycle. We'll set plutonium aside because it doesn't appear like Iran has a plutonium reprocessing program. There's a lot of facilities here, enrichment facilities, obviously, but also centrifuge manufacturing plants, conversion facilities that convert natural uranium into uranium hexafluoride for the enrichment in the centrifuges, conversion facility to convert it into metal, various weaponization facilities for shockwave generation, the detonation distribution, the neutron source or the initiator, and so forth. So can you walk us through kind of each step of that journey? And then as you do that, talk about what we know today about the damage or destruction that has been suffered at each of those steps.
Right. Everything starts with the uranium, which is in the ground. And when that is mined, it's just going to be ore, and you're going to have to mill that and turn that into what we would call yellow cake, which, as the name suggests, is kind of a yellowy powder. That's basically pretty harmless. No less than 1% of that material is fissile, and so nobody really worries about it at that phase. The Israelis, haven't bombed uranium mines, and I just don't think there'd be much point to bombing a uranium mine. Where it gets interesting then is when you get ready to enrich it. And so the first phase there is going to be conversion to uranium hexafluoride. You have to turn it into a gas. Iran largely did that at the uranium conversion facility at Isfahan. In above ground facilities, that facility, as best I can see, is no more. Iran probably has equipment to do that. That might be stored in other places. They've done that in other places in the past, but usually in pretty small amounts. So for an industrial scale enrichment program, you're going to need a pretty big facility. Once you have it in a cask, right, it's pretty transportable. And so you would bring that then to an enrichment facility. Now, here you're going to get kind of another line coming in because you've got to have facilities to make the centrifuges and some of the other equipment. For a centrifuge, the really important components are going to be the rotors, the parts that spin, and the bellows, because they're really tall. And when they spin, they vibrate, and you need like a bellows between so that they spin stably. Iran had a number of enrichment facilities. Well, I guess I should start. For centrifuge manufacture, they had a bunch of centrifuge manufacture facilities. All of the above ground ones have been destroyed. Unfortunately, because I think of the Israeli sabotage campaign a couple of years ago, Iran had moved all of the centrifuge manufacture to a new underground facility in a mountain not far from Natanz. And that facility still exists. So they can probably still make centrifuges, although, it's hard to know which components are made where. But the sensitive ones are done under the mountain.
And this mountain is a pretty special place because it's even deeper than Fordow.
Yeah,
right? And the assessment is that even the MOP, the 30,000-pound massive ordnance penetrator, can't reach it, that only potentially a nuke could actually nuke that facility.
Yeah, that's right. That's B6111 territory. So, I'll try to get through this really quickly. So then you've got the enrichment facilities. There were 2 at Natanz, the above ground pilot fuel enrichment plant that got toasted the first day of the war. And then there are 2 big underground enrichment halls that were very shallow. And the Israelis tried striking those. I don't know if the strikes damaged them, but certainly they knocked out all the power. And the IAEA thought that probably was pretty damaging to the centrifuges. If it wasn't the MOPs that hit them the other day, definitely eliminated those. Then there was a much deeper underground facility called Fordow, which the Iranians called it Fordow because it's nowhere near Fordow. nice guys. That's the facility that the Israelis couldn't hold at risk and that the US hit with the 12 massive ordnance penetrators. And then, there is allegedly one more facility somewhere near Esfahan. The IAEA was informed by Iran that it existed the day before the bombing. We're looking for it. May have found it, may not. We'll find out. But they had not yet installed any centrifuges there. So we don't really know what the status of that place is. Might just be a big empty hole in the ground. They might have a bunch of centrifuges stacked up waiting for installation. Don't know. And then when you're done enriching it, you've got this gas, right? So they take their stockpile of enriched uranium and they put it under a mountain near Isfahan, near the conversion facility. And then
Before we get to that point, though, you can enrich to different levels, right?
Yeah,
That's use up to 5% and 60%
Yeah.
is what they've done. But then for weapons grade, you need to be around 90%. Do you use the same exact infrastructure or something different?
Pretty much. I mean, it's the same. It's the same centrifuges. That you make slight modifications to the cascades. One of the reasons that Fordow was so alarming is it was set up to produce 90% enriched uranium, but could have been very quickly modified to produce 90%. Which, the Iranians, I think they thought they were putting pressure by doing that, but, it also had the effect of making that a very important.
Pressure worked.
Right. I mean, they wanted our attention and the attention was gotten. So right now, all that stuff, even the 60%, was sitting at Isfahan in the tunnels, which is still there. But if you want to make a fuel or a bomb, then you got to turn it back into metal. They did that above ground at Isfahan. That facility's gone. And then obviously once you have the metal, you want to, cast it into the kind of appropriate shape, which is, a sphere. And then you've got all the bomb design stuff you might want to do, right? So a lot of that work would have happened at Parchin, although...
Which got pretty decimated.
Yeah, Parchin took it pretty hard. One of the things that's a little complicated is we know that for the pre-2003 Iran nuclear weapons program, and there definitely was one, they were looking at kind of parceling these facilities out. Where they plan to do what is still a little unclear, but initially they were going to cast the pits at Parchin.
So if I were to summarize it across all these steps, and there are numerous, probably the only ones that are remaining is the centrifuge production facility under the mountain in Natanz, and maybe unclear this new facility for enrichment, which may or may not have centrifuges, and we don't know what kind of damage had been done in Fordow, maybe Natanz as well, right, to those cascades.
Yeah,
and
I'm assuming we're probably pretty messed up.
Yeah, but everything else has been decimated. When you think about reconstitution, and the other element of this, which we'll talk separately about, is the 400 kilograms of enriched, 60% enriched uranium, which we potentially don't know where it exists today. But setting that aside, how hard is it to reconstitute all the other pieces, the conversion to uranium gas, the conversion to metal, all the weaponization stuff that they've been doing? Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends how well they were prepared. If they didn't have a stockpile of centrifuges squirreled away, then they're going to have to start from scratch. Now, one of the things that was alarming that bothered the IAEA is because Iran had scaled back their cooperation, there isn't good visibility into how many centrifuges they may have produced. But maybe they were just being obstreperous. I mean, they really were focused a lot on diplomacy. So one question is, how long does it take them to make replacement centrifuges? Once they have the objects, if they start installing them at a location, they can install centrifuges. Come in, like hot dog buns. They come in cascades. They come in packs. Typically 164 to 174, maybe 180 in some configurations. So that a cascade, basically, 170 machines about that, they can install one of those in about basically like 1.5 a week. So depending on how big of a facility they wanted to rebuild, like a Fordow size thing where you're at like 12, you're looking at 18 weeks or something. So if they have the centrifuges, they can install them pretty quickly. And then you've got to enrich. And obviously it depends. Are you taking the existing 60%, in which case it'll enrich real quick. Even a small facility would enrich that in a matter of, month or two. But if you're starting from scratch, most of the work is going from 0 to 5%. And then it's a smaller amount of work to go to 5 from 20 and then 20 to 60. It's pretty easy to go 60 to 90. So that's the bad news. The good news is if you're starting from scratch, there's a lot of work to do. So, it could be months to a few years, with the caveat that, we don't really know about sensitive or secret facilities. Did they keep spare equipment? If they didn't, that timeline could could lengthen to a couple of years.
And when it comes to Fordow, you've been very vocal since the start of this campaign of why isn't Fordow being hit? This is sort of the central part of the program. Obviously, the United States came in on Saturday and bombed it, but that was 8 days after the start of the campaign. And there's some satellite pictures showing some trucks arriving at that facility. Who knows what they were doing? But obviously, you can take out the 400 kilograms of enriched uranium pretty quickly on those trucks. What about the cascades of centrifuges? Can you dismantle them quickly? Can you load them on trucks easily? Do you think that was doable?
I feel like it would be hard. I mean, you can, they're not clean, but maybe if it's a national emergency, you don't care about exposing workers.
I mean, even enriched uranium is not that radioactive,
It's
right?
not that radioactive, but it's not, but it like the fluorine's really toxic, so it's not nice. So, I think I looked at the pictures of the trucks. Most of those are trucks and heavy equipment that were used to backfill the entrances to the tunnels with dirt. So I've been trying to be very careful how I say this. Because it took so long, Iran had time to fill the entrances to the tunnels at both Isfahan and Fordow. So that suggests that they had time to remove things and that they had the kind of forethought to remove things. But what I don't know is how quickly they got on to the task and how much they tried to preserve. I think it would be pretty hard to get the centrifuges disassembled and packed up. On the other hand, it's a national emergency. So, you know, I suspect they probably had to make hard choices about what to take and what to leave behind. And honestly, moving a centrifuge is not going to be particularly good for it. So I'm not, this is not like the Saddam era. Oh, they moved all the WMD to Syria stuff. I think the strikes damaged a lot of equipment. I am more worried about Reconstitution and some of the underground facilities that remain that are too deep to be struck than I am the Iranians ever putting Fordow back into operation.
So is the central question then these 400 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium? Because if that got somehow destroyed at Fordow or is buried deep underground and they can't get to it, then even though they have the centrifuge manufacturing facilities, they'll need to build up new cascades. That can take a long time. Then you're starting to enrich back from scratch. And that will prolong the timeline much further than if they had the 400 kilograms and they can start pretty quickly.
Yeah, I mean, as you know, but full disclosure for listeners, I'm a little skeptical of the value of the delay that we're buying here, but whatever, it doesn't matter. Like, this is the strategy now. So the goal is to make that delay as long as possible. And if you want to get that lengthening, as far to the horizon as you can, you got to get the 400 kilograms of 60% HEU.
And I know you haven't published on this yet, so I'm not going to have you break the news, but the secret facility you may have found or not found, is it easy to destroy or is it?
No, it's deep. It's
Okay.
deep.
Okay.
It's deep. I mean, I say, is it, I don't know. Maybe we got the wrong place, but there's a really deep thing that got built.
And I assume you're going to be publishing research on this soon.
I mean, we're gonna try to get confirmed that we've got the right spot. Well, one of the problems is the Iranians built a lot of underground facilities, and so when we looked around Isfahan to see if we could find where the facility was, we saw lots of buried things. So there's there's a steel production facility that has tons of underground facilities in it, and so the Iranians like tunneling. So maybe we got the wrong place. But the point is, there are deep underground facilities around Isfahan that would be pretty hard, I think, to seriously damage.
As far as we know, they haven't purchased Elon's tunnel boring equipment, right?
Oh my God, yes.
All right. So let me ask you this. There's a lot of conversations of, what are the lessons that states are going to be drawing from this attack? Is the lesson one that North Korea took, that you should just get a nuclear weapon versus being a threshold nuclear state? Maybe that was a big miscalculation, but is one of the lessons really that if you're going to build a weapons program, start digging and dig under the deepest mountain you can possibly dig?
Yeah, and I think, so first of all, I do think a lot of countries are going to look at Kim Jong-un and look at the supreme leader and think Kim Jong-un got the better part of the deal. I also think there are, much of this campaign has been really brilliant, but the deep stuff was out of reach for the Israelis. Fordow would still be there if the U.S. hadn't gotten involved, and Fordow was
rumors that they had other options like maybe commando raid and other things.
Boy, maybe Iran is weak enough that you could do it, but I would not want to do, for example, a commando raid on a North Korean nuclear facility. That feels like a one-way trip to me. We should have a whole other conversation on the just incredible weakness of the Iranian state defense apparatus, but that's a whole other story. But yeah, deep, it would be hard to go after that with air power. And maybe something about operational security. Now, the Iranians got Stuxneted and the North Koreans didn't. And so, I think.
Well, there's another element of this too, that North Korea has not been screaming for 45 years, death to America, death to Israel. They've not been funding terrorist proxies. They've not been doing IEDs in Iraq that killed or maimed, over 1,000 American soldiers, right? So there was a different level of threat and perception of threat with with Iran versus North Korea.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, if you say that to a conservative South Korean or a conservative Japanese person, they're going to be really irritated at you. But it's certainly the case that even North Korea at its worst, it's like, well, in 2010, they sunk the Chonan, and I think if you're in the Middle East, you're like, oh, they sunk a ship. I am so sorry. Do you know what it's like to live next to these guys? So I do think there is just this kind of fascinating question. Like, once you get nuclear weapons, like, what do you do with them? Because you do have like a choice. Kim Jong-un has weirdly kind of chilled out. He has enjoyed the security provided by his nuclear weapons. I think if you, ask somebody in South Asia, Pakistan seems like they got more aggressive. What kind of country would Iran be if it had nuclear weapons? Oh, and I suspect the answer is it depends on who's running it. But you're right. That's a real difference in what it's like to live next to them.
Let me ask you about the scientists. What impact do you think that has had, that they've assassinated, I think, 14 or so scientists that are sort of at the top of this program?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think it's, there are enough scientists that I don't think it's a significant number in terms of the overall level of effort. At the same time, it is it's a leadership function. These are all pretty senior people. And so interesting questions about what that does for, morale. I mean, I sometimes, waggishly note, as a founder, I'm sure you don't feel this way, but I sometimes think like, well, in my life, if you wiped out the senior leadership, I think things would get better. But that's not a universally held opinion. So I think it.
But in terms of the knowledge that they have, do you think it's significant?
Yeah, I don't, in the sense that this is a pretty big normal industrial process. I don't think there's a lot of tacit knowledge. Where I'd be more worried about that would be missiles. Like with missiles, there's often a lot of tacit knowledge in production, and if you can eliminate key people, we had this experience where you shut down a missile production line and you try to stand it back up, and it's like weirdly hard to do. I don't know. That maybe I might be wrong.
Nuclear weapons are easier to build than missiles?
I mean, I think that they're probably the centrifuge engineering might be similarly hard. But yeah, I think the designs the Iranians were looking at were pretty simple and pretty well.
Even the miniaturization of the weapons.
Yeah, I mean, they were compact. I don't know if I'd call them miniaturized. They were small enough for a missile, but these are the kinds of weapons the U.S. was, looking at in the, late 50s, early 60s.
And speaking of missiles, we've seen the performance of the ballistic missile program.
Yeah.
Going back to last year, but certainly over the course of this 11 days or so. What do you think that tells us about the applicability of those medium-range ballistic missiles for nuclear warheads? Do you think that they can carry that payload? Do you think that they're accurate enough? Do they need to be accurate enough? How do you sort of think about that?
Yeah, I think that the whole point of a nuclear weapon is, it doesn't have to be accurate. And I think one thing we've seen is that the accuracy of the Iranian missiles is getting better, but it's not that great. The liquid propellant missiles, when we looked at the impacts at Nevatim, and there weren't that many. So
that's the air base in the desert.
Yeah. So the first strike with liquids, you were looking at like more than a kilometer, half fell within a kilometer of the target, which is
not great.
Yeah, not great. There's a reason the Israelis stopped trying to intercept them. It just wasn't worth the money. It's going to basically, maybe if they get lucky, create a crater in a runway. It's much cheaper to pave that than it is to try to intercept it. Solids are better, a few hundred meters. Hard to tell exactly, but even then, it's still really hard to kill stuff conventionally. So, I still think that if they went with a nuclear capability, they, it would still be targeting cities. maybe they could hit. I mean, they can hit an air base, but it's just unclear to me how much damage that's really going to do.
And
I mean, the other thing though is, do they get to launch them?
what about the? Well, yes, the Israelis have gone after the missile launchers, but as we've seen, despite
Yeah,
this multi-day campaign, there were still
yeah,
daily missile launches, small numbers, but if one gets
yeah.
through,
It ain't zero. That's
it's
true.
going to be a bad day. But what about the weight of the weapon itself? Do you think the missile can carry the payload that far?
Yeah, I mean, they're carrying like, 800,000 kilogram payloads, and the North Koreans ought to be able to get a nuclear weapon, down to that level or
The
lower.
Iranians.
Oh, jeez, I said the North Koreans. Yes. I mean, because the Iranians have, I mean, they did have a pre 2003 nuclear weapons program, and they had access to a number of designs, both from the Soviet Union and Pakistan. And those designs included weapons designs, but they also included some of the firing sets. And so, given modern electronics, I would think that making them more compact is probably they could do that.
How did they get the Soviet Union designs? I understand Pakistan and AQ Khan, but
Because they had former Soviet scientists come into Iran doing consulting. So I think, um, I having looked at some of the atomic archive materials, they had access to a variety of nuclear weapons designs. At least, assuming the Israelis are telling the truth.
and what do you make of the stories that we've seen in Wall Street Journal, some of the other outlets in recent months, that the weaponization program that was paused in 2003 may have been restarted? Do you buy that?
No, I don't. But I don't. But the issue is, when you halt a program or you suspend a program, you're really putting it into some kind of stasis. And so,
It destroyed clearly because the archive was preserved that the Israelis took in
right.
2019.
You're not shooting the scientists. Like, they still get up and go to work every day. I used to, and so, like, this is a voluntary decision that they make, because, either of their own internal politics, or they don't want to get hit, or, there's no like international treaty that really, well, the JCPOA did kind of, but there is no real clear distinction for what you're allowed to research and what you're not. So, like, the Swedes had a nuclear weapons program. They shut it down. I believe them. But, like, sophisticated radiochemistry work on nuclear explosions comes out of Sweden. And that's because they have retained that design knowledge. So I think if you're the Israelis and you're looking at their program in stasis, you're probably not going to be as chill as I am about it, right? You're going to see, like, well, these guys are still going to work. They're still doing studies. They're still around. And that's because they, existed in case the supreme leader changed his mind.
Yeah. And I mean, one of the problems, of course, that people have identified with GCPOA is that Iran kept enrichment, right? And there seems to have been no legitimate reason to keep that enrichment, because even though, okay, they have Bashir nuclear power plant that supplies electricity that doesn't need enriched uranium, but you could have had a deal where we pay for them to build heavy water nuclear reactors that don't require enriched uranium, right? They didn't want that, right? They wanted enrichment capability clearly to be a threshold nuclear power, which is ultimately the root of this problem that certainly Israel and to some extent the United States didn't want them to be nuclear power. And that was the crux of the matter.
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, this became about their sense of prestige and entitlement. I think there's very little commercial argument for having a domestic enrichment program. I mean, the fair thing you can say is, in the US, we also have a domestic enrichment program that makes zero sense financially. But I think in the case of the Iranians, it's not innocent. The enrichment program doesn't begin as a civilian program. It begins as a bomb program. And then,
And for us, most of our enriched uranium, I believe, is used in our nuclear subs, right? In our reactors there. So it's kind of a military program.
Right. Well, yeah. But I think in the case of Iran, I'm somebody who foregrounds politics. Like, there are definitely people in Iran who wanted a nuclear weapon. And I think the people who did not want one found that the best bureaucratic position they could take was a firm defense of the enrichment program as a bomb option. And, that makes sense. Like, imagine, if I'm going into a meeting in Iran, I probably don't want to be the guy who's like, no, the Americans are great. The Israelis are great. I don't know what you're talking about. We should be friends. You're going to be like, oh, I hate those guys too. But I hate them in this slightly different, less frightening way. So I think that's probably what happened. But yeah, they don't, it's not like this is essential technology for their well being. No.
Let's have a little bit of a debate here because
Okay.
clearly you are not a fan of this action that Israel took
No, that's true. I'm not.
the United
Fully
States took.
fair.
You were a big fan of GCPOA, and
Was.
I think there are arguments to be made that that was a deal that probably was the best deal we could have gotten, and maybe pulling out of it left us worse off. But setting all that aside, if the root of the problem is that Iran wants to be a threshold nuclear state at a minimum, with optionality to run to a weapon in a quick order, isn't the argument that destroying as much of that capability as possible through an action like we've just seen, and then periodically coming in and preventing a reconstitution with further attacks is a better one than a diplomatic solution that permanently leaves them in place with a program and ability to pull out of that agreement and quickly get to a weapon with potentially no military options then at the table because they'll have a ballistic missile program that can overwhelm certainly Israel, if not our own forces in the region and terrorist groups and the like that they could reconstitute.
Yeah, so I don't, not surprisingly, I don't agree. I mean, one argument I would make is that the JCPOA, if Iran had stopped complying with it and had made a race to a bomb, the Iranian program under the JCPOA would have been easier to destroy than this program.
Why is that?
They weren't allowed to enrich at Fordow, so everything had to be consolidated at Natanz. There was fairly good monitoring on their centrifuge production, so we had a pretty good idea of the number of centrifuges and where they were located. So it really kept the program consolidated and visible in a way that if the Iranians went out, I think an action like this would have been much more effective.
And there were no sunset clauses on that part, right?
I'd have to look. I think there probably for Fordow, I do not think there was a sunset clause, although I would want to double check. I think that for Natanz, the numbers were going to come off. So I understand the worry about the sunset clause. I would have said that if the deal were working tolerably well for both parties, you had a much better chance of extending it. Whereas when we walk away, then you lose all of it immediately. And now we're getting a sunset that's not as long, at least I would argue. I take the point that if you think that they were always going to weaponize, then you may well have been simply delaying things. I just, I'm not convinced that they were going to weaponize. They spent from 2007, they were a few months away from a bomb, and they jerked around for what is now like 17 years.
Yeah, John Ratcliffe apparently in one of his briefings to President Trump in the last week said you don't get to the 1 yard line in football and not try to score a touchdown. But you may kick the ball, right? You may run it, you may throw it, you may decide on which down you want to do it, right? Not to get into too much of an American football analogy for our international listeners, but the point is that the other analogy I used, if you buy a bed from IKEA and it's stored in your box in your storage room, you probably bought it because at some point you're going to put it together, maybe when you have guests over and you need it, but it's not just bought there to be sitting in a box forever, right? So if they have that optionality, it is being built under enormous expense, right? Potentially $500 billion of expense, particularly when you start counting all the sanctions, economic costs, et cetera. It's being done with a purpose that at some point, whether it's a current leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, or a future leader may decide now is the time to finish this up, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem that I have with Ratcliffe's analogy is that it assumes that everybody's on the same team and everybody has the same goal. And what I try to point out is you don't pick opacity. You don't pick to be a few months away from the bomb for as long as the Iranians did. If your problem is technical, it's because your problem is political. So I think the Iranians themselves were divided. They have real internal divisions. They have people who have different ideas of what the future of that country is. And for whatever reason, they just could not pick a particular outcome. So, I do think that there was some non-trivial chance that they wouldn't have weaponized during the lifetime of this regime. Because I don't think this regime is going to last forever. I mean, I
Well, those
don't think
things don't last forever, but it can last a long time.
yeah, it could. And, with North Korea, that regime has turned out to be, much more resilient than we had imagined. But, I think they have their own politics. And for me, one of the benefits of the JCPOA is it gave the people who wanted a different relationship between Iran and the West a leg up. Those people are gone now, by the way. So, there may be a point at which, and I will happily concede this because we certainly experienced this with North Korea. There did come a point at which the North Koreans were still pretending to talk and they were no longer interested. So, and we don't, to this day, we don't know when that happened. So, I do think that once Trump left the JCPOA, there was a limited window to get it back together. And, if historians 20 years from now look back at this and say, yeah, that was true, but not after, I don't know, September 2019. Sure, I'd
Well,
believe that.
that was part of my question is that, if you're debating the world with Iran under GCPOA and this action, that seems like a much more even debate potentially, right? Or maybe even somewhat preferring GCPOA. But that was not the world we lived in, right? And we pulled out of GCPOA. You got the centrifuge at Fordow. You got the 400 kilograms enriched uranium. So given that and the prospects maybe of a new GCPOA at this point, but now the program is much more resilient, right, to strikes, is that a closer call?
I mean, it probably is. It's just, given the way things played out, it's hard when if you're in my position and you say to Trump, like, hey, don't do this, and he does it, like, you're probably rationally right that when we come to this later, there's a point at which it's like, okay, well, I don't want to do this, but like, I guess this is the plan. Some people are better team players than I am. Maybe this is why Ratliff is using the football analogy. But I'm like, no, I don't want to play this game.
You have to go back to zero-based budgeting, right? We are
Yeah,
where we are, and what's the best path forward? And I'll tell
it's
you, I
you're
had a
not wrong.
conversation with a very senior Biden administration official that said that the reason they didn't get an Iran deal under the Biden term is basically because they didn't want to try. That
Yeah, I
basically,
know.
they just viewed it as a loser for the midterms and then the general, and no one wanted to do it.
By the way, because it's a loser for the midterms and the general, like the JCPOA was extraordinarily unpopular. There is no policy that I have ever.
Even a lot of Democrats didn't like it.
I mean, Chuck Schumer and Ben Cardin and Bob Menendez created the conditions under which it could pass. So they were instrumental to its passage, but they did that in a way that allowed them all to vote against it. And so I think when your friends on the Hill are figuring out how to help you pass something with their opposition, that's a pretty good sign that this stuff's unpopular. Yeah, no, it's totally unpopular. I'm an academic, not a politician.
Last question to sort of wrap this up, and this is purely in the realm of speculation. No one knows, but your best guess, if indeed we have a ceasefire now,
Yeah.
at least for the time being, what do you think Iran is going to do? Are they going to pull out of the Nonproliferation Treaty? Although, as I pointed out, if they do that, then Bushehr, their civilian nuclear power plant, is a little bit of a problem because it's supported by the Russians. There are Russian nuclear scientists. They may have to pull out unless Iran does a side deal with IAEA on the safeguards agreement for that site. Do they not pull out and just limit the presence of inspectors from IAEA? Do they run to the bomb? Like, what's your best guess on where this goes?
Yeah, I don't know because the Iranians strike me as just not always the greatest decision makers. I mean, I can tell you what their options are, and I know what I would do, but that's normative. If I were the Iranians, I would kind of act like Trump won, and I would be like, oh, we've given up enrichment, and I would let the IAEA and do nothing but inspect bombed out facilities, and
While you're doing the covert program.
and I would 100% reconstitute the covert program, and I would do it with very reduced IAEA scrutiny. And I think that, the Russians and the Chinese aren't really going to put any pressure on me. So, that's what I do. But that's not how that's me. That's not them. So, I think
They're
they're
also
pretty,
worried about saving face and
that's
regime
right.
preservation, right? So just saying Trump won, I think, is a
I
non-starter.
think they can't do it. Right. And, Larijani has talked about killing Grossi, which is just absurd to me.
Grossi
So
is
I
the director of IAEA.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Who I think has been incredibly fair and even-handed and has done a great job, and the Iranians are, ungrateful. That said, I think they are really laying the groundwork to reduce their cooperation with the IAEA. So I don't know if they're going to be able to thread the needle between pulling out of the NPT and reducing their cooperation with the IAEA and keeping Trump satisfied. That's like a weird balancing act, and I don't know if they're going to be able to pull it off. Like, I don't know why they didn't just keep talking to Witkoff.
Well, they wanted to, but Trump decided that they were stringing him along, which they probably weren't.
Yeah, I mean, they're bad at stringing people along then. That's all I can say, because Kim Jong-un was good at it.
Yeah, but I think the stakes were a lot different, and we didn't have Bibi Netanyahu wanting to bomb Pyongyang. But
Yeah,
and this is truly the last question, but when it comes to reconstitution, we've talked about the different parts that are destroyed that they have to rebuild, and a bunch of unknowns with regards to 400 kilograms of enriched uranium and so forth. But when you also think about the psychological impact of what's just been done, right? And it's twofold, right? Israel showed the capability to assassinate a lot of his nuclear scientists and others working on the program. So if you're thinking about participating in the program going forward, you may think twice. And then secondarily, unquestionably, there's going to be a huge effort by this regime to find the moles, the Mossad moles that have given up all this intel. And they may find the moles and they may find innocent people that they'll claim to be moles, right? So if you're an Iranian scientist or even military person working in the program, you might be thinking about getting hit from both sides. The regime that might be investigating you for being a spy for Israel and the Israelis that may be thinking about assassinating you. Reconstituting a program under the best of circumstances is hard. Is it even harder given all these pressures?
I think it just depends on the culture that they create. It's not like Stalin's Russia was a particularly pleasant place and they were able to get things done even with a fair amount of personal infighting. We don't have a lot of insight into North Korea, but that seems to be a place where there's, a fair amount of stress. And so what I would anecdotally say is and this is where the actual those assassinations may really matter, which is, what is the leadership culture of the program? Are those people replaced by charismatic individuals who will have some sense for what it takes to get people to go along and do the work? In which case, then I think they can reconstitute it. Or, will they be replaced by, people who are demoralizing? Like, I realize that's kind of a non-answer, but, I think what we saw is the Iraqis were just terrible at this, and the Libyans were not great and the Syrians were not great. And that had a lot to do with their capacity more than I think anything else.
Yeah. All right, Jeffrey, a lot of unknowns here, but you've clarified as much as I think can be clarified at this point. Always a pleasure to have you. Please come back on. Good to see you.